Yep, I'm here.
Hi, I couldn't get Ron, unfortunately, but speaking with both of you is just fine with me.
Okay.
Do you both hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Ron and Heather? Okay, good, great. Great. Well, thank you both so much for speaking with me. And I think that I inadvertently found out, James, how you originally saw my article. I'm on a listserv, like a sex research listserv, and someone had mentioned sending it to you, and I happened to see that. So I am curious about your thoughts on Aaron Calloway's interview with me, and on decisions like his, but we can get to that first. So I'm curious about how each of you got involved with Foreskin Restoration and any sort of anti-circumcision activism. What are each of your stories?
Mine's pretty straightforward. My mother's family, being very Catholic and French, did not partake of circumcision. My father's family, of course, did. And my mother quite believed in it. But I grew up, as a consequence of that, knowing all of my cousins were intact. And seeing that, it didn't take very long. I think I was probably somewhere between 5 and 7 years old when I realized that I was the one that had something missing. And realizing that you've got something missing is a pretty key factor in this. And honestly, it sat in the back of my mind, just knowing the fact that you can see somebody go through their entire life intact and never have a problem and be fine, kind of puts the lie to circumcision. And when I was about 37 years old is when I finally realized how much anger I had over this. And I decided I have to do something. And, going online, searching, that led me to Foreskin Restoration. And
where do you... Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Where do you think that the anger came from? Was this more rooted in, seeing that you were in some way different and knowing that you didn't have to be, or was this related to the issues of bodily autonomy or even sexual pleasure?
Well, it's definitely rooted in sexual pleasure. That's absolutely for certain. Feeling like there's an element missing. Finding that you're, with the woman of your dreams and, everything's going absolutely smoothly and perfectly. You get to the sexual side of things, and all of a sudden there's an element missing. It's something that sticks with you. It's something that weighs on you. As much as you enjoy it, there's just a piece that isn't there. And, that changes a person after a time, when you start to realize something. You don't know what it is. You can't place your finger on it. Something is missing. And, of course, the normal male psyche in this is, well, it's not my fault. It must be her fault.
Right.
And at a certain point, if you're aware of yourself, you have to go, well, I've been through 4 ladies of my dreams, and I had the same problem with all 4. Maybe it's not their fault.
Right.
And so it's not really conscious right off the start. You have to be very reflective and really look at yourself and look inward.
Yeah. So, Juan, what about you? What guided you to restoration?
Okay, my experience is a little bit different because I was born in Colombia and circumcision is not done there as a routine. But for whatever reason, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I was circumcised. The doctor said I had phimosis, which I know now that it's really not that. But
how did you find that out?
Let me get there.
Okay.
The experience of the circumcision itself for me was traumatic because I wasn't prepared for that. So I kind of was that they were going to cut off my penis.
Okay.
So I was screaming, I was kicking, I tried to run from the doctor, and then somebody grabbed me from behind, and at that point everything goes black in my memory. I only recently learned that at that point they put me to sleep with anesthesia. I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, please.
Yeah, when I tell this, I'm sorry, I just get like immediately, it's a little, I think it's post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, no, and whatever you like, please, I only want you to feel comfortable, so if there's something you don't feel comfortable talking about, by all means, let me know.
No, I don't have any problem saying everything, it's just that I have that physical reaction that I even feel my skin creeping. But, so, I had an element of sadness, but I didn't really I didn't know that was a surgery. I didn't know what they did. I knew that my penis looked different afterwards. But I didn't know, if anyone else was circumcised or not. I had no concept of anything. I didn't ever talk with my family about it. I didn't talk with my friends. But when I became an adolescent and an adult, and I started having sex relationships and having relationships, it was always the one thing that I was self-conscious about. That disclosure, it was for me like a secret, like something that I was internally ashamed of. But once the relationship started going, and I could get over that. So anyway, I moved to the United States when I was 29 years old, and I was I started reading stuff on the internet, and then that's when I started to learn about circumcision and about foreskin restoration. That's because I was curious about people who were circumcised, who were not circumcised, and understanding what was that was being given for before. But then that's when I started also learning that babies here are circumcised most of the time. And when I saw that happening, when I saw a co-worker who had 2 babies, and he comes to my house and he starts changing the diaper of one of his babies, and I see that child is circumcised, and I'm thinking, okay, I was circumcised because I had phimosis, because I had something. But this is a baby. How could he have something so soon? And that was I just had a bad reaction to that. So that's when I started learning about it more. And then when I found about how it started in the 19th century with John H. Kellogg, and the whole thing about punishing masturbation in children, that really made me angry, because for me, individual freedom is very important.
Absolutely.
Sexuality is very important. And the idea that somebody will cut out of the body of a child to punish them for masturbating, for touching their bodies, that was just, it immediately made me very angry. And that's when I started reading. I couldn't stop reading at all. And that day I started restoring. And from that day on, I started talking against it, because I couldn't stand it anymore.
Yeah, that's something that I think every person who comes to intactivism shares, is that the root of this surgery is intentional harm and destruction. That's how it got its start in North America. And it's targeted against children who've yet to even sin, really. To use I can't think of a better word than that, that's really what was motivating parents was this idea of prevention of sin by taking away the child's choice and their bodily autonomy.
Right. So I feel like with regard to a lot of that, it's clearly sort of morphed away from that, and the general idea behind it, or the general understanding of it now, is that it has more to do with hygiene and cleanliness, and whether or not that's true is not something that I'm asserting, but like...
Well, those of us who've looked into that's a complete fallacy. And it is something that is a talking point for those people who really want to keep this process going. But this is something that's been studied and studied very rigorously, and they've discovered that, hygiene is not the parent's number one concern when they're getting their child circumcised. Infections, not the number one reason. The number one reason studied again and again has been the circumcision status of the father. If the father is not circumcised, it is incredibly rare for a family to even consider having their child cut. So these ideas of hygiene are ideas that are used to support something that is not practiced for those reasons.
Right. Juan, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add something. In 1980, one Jewish man wrote a book about circumcision. He talked with 3 doctors to ask about what they thought about circumcision, because he supported circumcision at that time, and one of the doctors supported it. One of the doctors was neutral, and the other doctor was against it. So he was like, okay, if this surgery is so good, why do I have 3 different opinions from medical doctors?
Yeah, I think that was Leonard Glick's...
Subject. He studied for 10 years, and he wrote a book called Circumcision, an American Health Fallacy. And when you read that, and when you read, like, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics statement of circumcision, it becomes clear that it's shameful. Everything that they were using to promote it up to 1980s has been already debunked by that person, by Edward Wallerstein. And there are only 2 things that they have added afterwards, which is
UTIs and AIDS.
And cancer, and HIV and AIDS. And everything really falls off. When you really go into the studies and you see what they are, you can find very easily that there are a lot of fallacies there, and that there's an interest in maintaining the practice and just keep going. They don't want to stop.
So what do you think might be the best way to dispel the myths around this, or to sort of remove some of the social stigma that makes people believe that they need to match son with father?
Well, it's education. You have to confront people's preconceived notions. And as intactivists, or at least as myself as an intactivist, I've seen this where you're confronting someone who's considering circumcising their child, and they bring out all the old myths. It's cleaner to cut. And you go, well, actually, there's studies that show that the biodome, basically the bacteria that live under the foreskin, actually keep it cleaner if left intact than if you cut it off. You start showing them all of the studies that have been done that the cleanliness is simply not an issue, and then they'll move on to the next thing. They're constantly moving the goalposts, and they get quite angry about this. And at a certain point, they're left with nothing else. And what's strange to me is if you go to a parent of a new child that new child has to go in for a surgery, as they believe, you would think proving to them that child doesn't need the surgery would be a huge relief to the parent.
Right.
You would think, can you imagine if your child had, and the doctor was telling you your child needs an appendectomy in order to survive or in order to live, and your child is brand new, newborn, and you're about to subject them to this surgery. And then another person comes along and goes, that's not a problem with his appendix. Pat him on the back until he burps. and he'll be fine. Wouldn't you as a parent be incredibly relieved? But parents aren't. They're very, very emotionally attached to the idea of genital cutting. I've said it many times, and I've yet to really be proven wrong. Parents love the act of genital cutting more than they love their own child. And getting them to confront all of these myths and fallacies is part of that education. And usually what ends up happening is the child, they'll leave him intact, and then once they've had a little bit of time to think about it, they're like, holy crap, I can't believe I ever even considered that. What the heck was I doing? But it's so culturally ingrained that it's an emotional reaction, not a conscious one, and the only way to get around that is through education.
Right. Okay. So I actually have a cultural question here, and this is for you, Juan. So like you noted that you grew up in a culture that's essentially the reverse of the United States, where most men are not circumcised. So that means you sort of had the reverse experience that an intact man would have growing up in the United States. So how do you think that is different or the same? Do you think that in a way it produces a similar sort of stigma where a child is just different? Can you speak to that?
I think that up to 20 years ago, yes, that's probably the case. The men who were not circumcised were stigmatized and were a lot of times self-conscious, and that I know that for a fact that made people go for adult circumcisions that they didn't need at all, just because they didn't fit properly, that they had the feeling that they were missing something. And then they find their error, and it's too late, usually. But I think that the culture has changed. For example, I've learned that many men who are circumcised don't even know that they were subjected to an operation. And sometimes they find out in a locker room, like if somebody else is taking a shower and they're not circumcised, and they're like, that looks weird. And then they find out that they are the ones who were subjected to a surgery. And I've seen that happen. I've heard from people tell the experience, and it usually was traumatic for them to realize what happened to themselves.
Yeah, this is something that you have to...
Every cultural change, change in culture is painful, because there's a lot of people who have been on one side and on the other, so they have to confront their condition, their situation, and accept that it may not be the ideal, but there are other possibilities.
I wonder if you think that one path to change might be just sort of more open discussion about circumcision, so that it removes that situation where you have a young boy in a locker room learning just by observing other people.
May I interject something here?
So do you think that if there were just discussion of it, if there were something that parents tell their children, some boys are circumcised, some boys are not, this is what that means, that would improve anything?
Absolutely.
May I interject something?
Communication changes everything.
May I interject something?
Yeah.
I don't think more discussion about circumcision is really helpful. Because let's face it, the CDC came out with some interesting numbers here. The CDC is now claiming that 1/6 of the population of the planet is circumcised. So that translates to 83% of the people, the men walking around on this planet, they're intact. So more discussion about the aberration that is circumcision isn't helpful. More discussion about what's normal is helpful. People especially in America,
do you think that reinforces a similar sort of shaming?
Well, of course it does. When we keep the conversation focused on the aberration, you're completely ignoring what is normal for, by far, the vast majority of men on this planet. And there has been no conversation in America, in North America, really, about simply what is normal male sexual function. So, continuing to talk about a surgery that really has no use, except in extraordinarily rare circumstances, isn't where change needs to come from. Change needs to come from talking about what's normal. And I know for myself, encountering what's normal, finally doing the research on what's normal, was what triggered me to begin restoration.
And actually, can I add something, James?
Please.
If you go to the bookstore and you look at the books on anatomy of the human body, and you look at the male genitalia, you're not going to see a representation of the foreskin, and they are going to only mention, they will give one sentence to the foreskin. They will say, the penis has a foreskin and it's usually removed by circumcision. That's the whole extent that they will dedicate to the foreskin on the book that we have in the United States.
Yes. Fortunately, we're looking at a world that has access to, well, the entire, knowledge of humanity at our fingertips with the internet. So if you have any...
I'm very curious, how do you think this would have been different? Because it sounds like both of you got most of your information from the internet, so what...
Well, you have to. It leads you...
that access.
Yeah. It leads you to different books that you can read. It leads you to different people that you can read. It brings you to different groups and forums. Ron Lowe, when we were emailing, he said he was going to mention that his particular website that he runs, foreskin-restoration.net, he has had, in the last 10 years, over 100,000 active members. 100,000 that have just come to him not through any form of advertising, not through any concentrated movement. His website literally just exists, and people find him. Over 100,000 over the last 10 years, and that number keeps growing. I think he said he has something like, in the last year, he's had something like 30,000 members post and ask questions. And in the last month, he has over 6,000 people actively posting and asking questions. And these are people that are coming to him without any education in the mainstream media. These are people that are just trying to find the information. The number of men that are restoring or are starting restoration is simply staggering. And they're doing all of this without there being any public discussion about circumcision or about the intact male.
If you look at the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement or the new recommendations from the CDC, there is no mention at all of people doing foreskin restoration. There is no mention of what we are doing.
They will discuss adult men undergoing genital amputations. They will discuss adult circumcision, but they're not interested in looking at the other side of it, and that's people like Juan and myself who have been circumcised, who have gone through this kind of circumcision shame, and who have reversed it. I mean, we have knowledge of at least 100,000 men just in the USA that have done this. And this is a population they're not interested in studying. Because if they do, they're going to find that sexual satisfaction is vastly improved, that sexual sensation is vastly improved, that our own sense of bodily autonomy is vastly improved. They don't want to hear the other side of the conversation. So, for example, you had your article with the young man who was circumcised as an adult, and his only real reasons for having it done were social. His only satisfaction came from, well, now I fit in with the crowd. And when you asked him pointedly about sexual sensation, he had to admit that it's gone away in a big way. And then there's people like Juan and myself who've done foreskin restoration and have discovered a lot of that can be recovered. Not all of it, but so much more than I ever thought was possible.
Yeah. So, I don't know if this is hypothetical for you. Are either of you parents to sons?
Pardon me?
Are you parents to sons, either of you?
I am.
Okay.
I have one boy. He's 17 years old. He was born in Colombia, and he was not circumcised. And obviously, being in Colombia, it was not offered. But I would never have consented, not even know.
Right.
Even at that time, I didn't know.
So here's my question, and I think it presents a broad, pardon the pun, for the unintentional pun, but there's clearly a lot between, like the issue of sexual pleasure and bodily autonomy, because if one is to advocate for bodily autonomy, that means that maybe one day, if your son decided to get circumcised for his own reasons, that's sort of his prerogative, right? So how do you reconcile those things?
Well, for myself...
Your son makes a later in life decision to get circumcised.
No, I understand what you're saying.
I think that I cannot decide for my son. I cannot decide who he's going to marry, or if he's going to be heterosexual, homosexual. I cannot decide if he's going to live in my city or he's going to move to the other side of the country. And I cannot decide if he's going to get a tattoo or not. Those are things that belong to him. And even if he decides to get circumcised, I can give him the information that I have about it, but in the end, it's his decision.
Yeah, that's the thing.
If he has a child, I will oppose him circumcising a child. But again, if his child was ever to decide to get circumcised as an adult, that will be his decision as well.
Yeah, the job of a parent is to get their child to adulthood with their body and all of their choices for themselves intact. The job of a parent is not to make a decision that will affect the child when they're 40 years old, when they're 50 years old, when they're 60 years old. The job of a parent is to get them to the age of 18 where they can make decisions for themselves. And you fail that job on day one when you decide to take away one of those choices for that child through genital cutting. So if I had a child, and I don't, but if I did, my job would be to preserve his choices for himself. If he then wants to have piercings done, tattoos done, if he wants to love who he wants to love, if he wants to change his language, change his school, change everything about how I raised him, he can do that because all of his choices are intact. And if one of those is he wants to change how his genitals are configured, I'll support him in that. I'll make sure that he knows all the information about it, knows what he's getting into and the reality of what he's choosing for himself. But absolutely, once you reach adulthood, what you choose for your own body is your choice. And that's the way it must be.
Do either of your parents know that you decided to pursue restoration later in life?
Yes, mine do.
Yes.
James, you said yours do?
Yes, absolutely.
And how did they feel about it? Did they sort of change their minds about the decision to circumcise you? How did they feel?
At first I started asking questions because knowing that my family, my mother's side of the family, does not partake of this ritual, I wanted some answers. And they became very, very defensive. And it took them about a year for them to finally come around to the realization that, yeah, this was a mistake. And I haven't really spoken with them about my progress. My mother, in passing one day, asked me how it was going, and I told her, it's incredible. It's an absolutely incredible journey. It's one of the best things I've ever done for myself. She said, I'm so glad, and we ended the conversation at that. But there was definitely a conflict period that I had to go through with my parents before we could really move forward with any kind of a positive relationship.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel as if you've, forgiven them or reached that point of acceptance?
I had to make a distinction for myself. I do not forgive the genital cutting. It's a simply unforgivable act. There's nothing about it that is forgivable. Nor could I forgive the absolutely insulting reasoning that they gave me for choosing it. But with that understanding that I don't forgive the reasons and I don't forgive the act, I do forgive the people that my parents are today.
Mm-hmm. Juan, what about you? Do your parents know?
I only talked with my mother one time about this, and I started talking not about me and not asking about my personal situation. I talk about my activism, and I talk about the things that I had learned and the things that I had seen, and I know that it affected her. Like, she immediately felt that I was going to say, hey, I'm angry at you, I hate you, or something like that. And I told her that I am only grateful for everything that she has done for me in my life, and then I told her about my restoration, and I think we pretty much ended the conversation in a hug, because I knew that she needed it and I needed it as well. There's something more I want to say. Hold on. I don't have anger towards my mom, but I realized that the anger that I have is against the doctor that did it. And that's probably because of the difference in age.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor, yeah.
No, go ahead.
And I've looked up the information of the doctor. He was my mom's cousin, and he passed away a while ago. So, well, I don't really have any anger towards anyone who's alive or who has any.
Right. So, do you mind telling me a little bit about the Intactivist community and sort of what your online community is like, and whether you all, just what it's all about?
Well, it's from my perspective, it's like nothing I've ever been a part of before. There are kind of, if you want to call them that, some celebrities in the movement. Nobody that you'd know of from mainstream media, but people that have had a lot of influence. But there's no leaders. There's no one person that's setting policy or deciding what's a worthy cause or anything like that. It's a very organic coming together of people that happen to share the same idea, that children should be protected from day one, that the job of parents is to get them to adulthood in one piece. And some come to it through regret because they cut without thinking, and then after cutting, only after they cut their children did they finally do their education on what they'd actually taken from them. In fact, they're probably one of the biggest parts of our movements right now is what they call regret parents. There's men who've come to despise what's happened to them. There's men like Juan and myself who are restoring. There's mothers, who didn't cut, who are very vocal. There's every type of ethnicity. A large part of our movement comes from cultures and religions that traditionally circumcise, who've then questioned their religion and questioned the act. There's no one type of person that comes to this. There's no one leader. There's no one policy. It's just a very loose group of people who've come together to protect children, and that's really been my experience.
The other thing about it is a very multidimensional group. You're going to find lawyers working on activism. You're going to find people who are in health professionals. You're going to find artists. One of the earliest activists was George Wald, who is a Nobel laureate. He was a professor in Harvard, and he wrote in 1978 an essay. He was a Jewish man, circumcised with circumcised son, and he learned about it. He started looking at it from the biological point of view. He wrote an excellent essay against circumcision.
Yeah.
And the typical intactivist, regardless of their profession or their education level, has read a lot about circumcision, has read every study that comes out, whether it's for or against, because we just can't stop like this. We have to read everything and be prepared for everything and understand it as much as we can.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think we all share, is we've probably read far more articles that promote genital cutting than we've read articles that stand against it. But when you start to read them all, that's when you start to really notice the things they leave out. The 2012 American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on infant circumcision, they left out complications. They left out meatal stenosis, which is a very, very well understood and thoroughly studied complication of infant circumcision. It's the narrowing of the meatus due to drying out, due to rubbing, due to being exposed and not having the protective covering of the prepuce. And they've known since 1978, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that up to 32% of all children that are circumcised will suffer from some degree of meatal stenosis, and the only correction for which is a second surgery. More modern studies have shown around a rate of about 20% of all children that are circumcised, which is probably a bit more realistic number. And this is something the American Academy of Pediatrics knows full well and has studied themselves. And yet they left out their own studies on this complication from their own policy statement, and went on to say that the benefits of genital cutting outweigh the risks. But further on in their own statement, they also say the risks of genital cutting are unknown. Well, they are very well known. And it really stands out to somebody who's read all of the papers on it, who've read all of the pro and the cons, that a company, they're a company, the American Academy of Pediatrics, would intentionally leave out information that they themselves have thoroughly studied. And suddenly that wakes a lot of people up to, hey, wait a minute, this group that is supposed to be protecting me is hiding information from me. What's going on here?
Yeah, can I add something?
Yeah. Of course.
Even when they give you the information, they leave you in some ways. Like the recent CDC guidelines, it says that the rate of complications are very low, and they give an estimate of 0.1% of
0.2%.
Yeah. And when you apply that estimate, that percentage to 1.2 million babies that are circumcised every year, you can extrapolate that at least 5,000 babies will have complications every year from circumcision, from a surgery that they didn't need to begin with. And most of these complications may not be critical, but some of them mean a child who's going to lose his penis, or a child who's going to die, or a child who's going to have to go into an emergency surgery to give him back some of the skin when they pretty much skin the whole penis out. So they'll tell you that it's very low rate of complications, but when you take the numbers and really see the human impact of everything, it's a lot more than what they're telling you.
Yeah, this is another thing about the CDC. They're another good example of manipulating the numbers or outright lying. In their latest recommendations, they say that complications from circumcision are around this 0.2% mark. I think they may have said 0.15 at this point. But later on, if you read through their technical documents which are attached, they do actually reference meatal stenosis. But they had to search far and wide to find a study that would put it below 20%, which all the other studies have shown. And the only one that they could find was an Iranian study, which still placed the complication rate at 7%. So if they're including a 7% complication ratio in their own technical document, why do they then come back and say that there's only a 0.2% complication ratio? The math simply doesn't work. Either there's a 7% complication ratio or there's a 0.2, and you have to prove either side of those, and they haven't proven either. And when you know a lot about this, then you start to recognize it.
Right.
But you know...
Final question for both of you. How do men respond when you start talking to them about this? Are they generally... I assume that you've had conversations with people who haven't necessarily gone looking on the internet for information about restoration. So what do men say?
Well, they're incredibly curious about it. There's simply no information out there. They think it's a surgical procedure, and they're afraid of more knives coming near their penis, understandably so. So they start to ask questions. They're like, well, how is it done, and how long does it take, and do I have to see a doctor? Do I have to rub creams on my penis? And it's such a simple procedure that it actually, just to say, well, it's just putting tension on the remaining skin. It's using a very well-known technique to lengthen the remaining skin over time through gentle tension. It doesn't hurt. It's not a scary procedure. It's just something that takes time and privacy. That's really all that it takes, is time and privacy. If it hurts, you're doing it wrong. And to a lot of men, that sounds too good to be true. And you have to engage in a very long conversation to get through all of their preconceived notions about it. But the desire for this information, it's ravenous. People really want to know, how do I get a foreskin back? And I've been asked it so many times. My email and my inbox are overflowing with questions about it.
Well, great. I have no more further prepared questions, but if there is anything else that either of you would like to add, any additional responses that you have to the earlier interview, anything of that sort, I'm still listening.
Well, go ahead, Juan. You say something, and then I'm going to say something.
Okay, the only thing I'm thinking is, I started restoration because I was angry about circumcision and because I thought it was cool that I would be able to get it back somehow. I didn't have expectations about the sexual part of it, but the day that one day on its own, it gave me an experience that it just showed me how circumcision is really mutilation. And it was, I normally have my restoration device while I am at work, and one day for whatever reason I took it off early because I was tired. And then I was driving home, and I started getting these sparks of pleasure. It's like almost like the sky in front of me was they were throwing fireworks, and I was just driving. And I was like, oh my God, what's this? But this sensation was very clearly coming from my genitals, but it was visual for me. And when I got home, I immediately went to the restroom to check what's going on. And it was the first time that the skin had rolled over the glands on its own, a little bit. And it was just the fact that the skin was touching the glands and the glands was touching the skin. That was triggering a sensation that I had never had before.
Wow.
And so for me, that was like, okay, this sensation I should have been with me my whole life. So people who are not circumcised probably take it for granted, and people who are circumcised have no way of even thinking about it, have no way of knowing about it. And that's what basically the gliding function of the foreskin, moving over the glands, and they stimulate each other. That's, I guess, the coolest part of my experience.
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was much the same for me. I started tugging. Now, for myself, I don't use a device. You don't need a device. You can do it with just your own two hands. It just takes more privacy than wearing a device underneath of your clothes. But yes, there came a point. I did it really just for the cosmetics of it. And there came a point, just like for one, there came a point where suddenly what remained of my inner foreskin was in contact with my glands, and they're kind of rolling over each other. And for a circumcised man, you can touch what remains of your inner foreskin and it feels okay, and you can touch the edge of your glands and it feels okay. But it's not like touching both of those at the same time. When they roll over each other, it's something happens exponential. Your brain is designed from birth to feel that sensation of those two structures rolling over each other. And when you feel that, an explosion is an understatement. It suddenly opens up your entire body to a feeling that you've never felt before. A lot of people in foreskin restoration call it a full body orgasm. And there's a level of feedback to that when you're with a partner, you can feel them more. You have more control over your orgasm. And when it does happen, my God, nothing a circumcised man can experience, no matter how good or how satisfied he is, can compare to that. It is a completely other dimension that we're supposed to feel. It's supposed to be there. But somebody at birth or at 5 years of age or whatever age decided that I wasn't worthy of ever experiencing that in my life. And that feeling it for the first time changed me. You can't remain silent anymore once you've finally feeling how your body is supposed to function. in a way that you've been denied all your life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, sorry, I was taking notes. Wow. Okay. Well, again, that was all I have. If I am still looking to speak to Ron, so if either of you speak to him, I would really appreciate if you let me know. But if I have any follow-up questions, which I might, do you mind if I get in touch with either of you again?
No problem whatsoever.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Anytime.
I appreciate this so much. The interview, I'm going to get it transcribed as soon as possible, but I believe it's supposed to be going up Sunday evening.
Oh, wow.
And I can let you know once I know that for sure, but I usually write a piece that goes up Sunday evenings. So I think that it will be that one. If you have any questions for me,
well,
mind if I use your full names?
Please do. Please use my full name.
Yep, it's fine.
Okay, and I believe I have proper spellings of both of them in my email.
Now, some questions that you haven't asked that I'm just curious about. Do you want to know more of the mechanics of how this is done? How foreskin restoration is accomplished?
So I read the guide that you sent me, and I looked through Ron's website.
Oh, perfect.
So I think that I have the information I need. If there is something that you would like to add to that, if you don't think that that will be adequate, I was planning to describe it. I usually write my Q&As, as I'm sure you saw from the Aaron Calloway one, include like a pretty brief, maybe like 3 to 4 paragraph introduction for some background, and then just our talk.
Okay.
So I was going to describe how restoration works in there. Is there anything that you think I specifically need to include there?
If you've got a copy of my Foreskin Restoration FAQ, that's a great place to start. At least from my
maybe quote from that a little bit.
Oh, feel free.
Descriptions of, you've given some of the same descriptions here, but your descriptions of pleasure afterwards and whether or not it should be painful and how it works.
Yes, please do. You have my permission.
Now, one thing that I find interesting is that this was first done by Jewish people 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that's briefly mentioned on your frequently asked questions, James, right?
About Jewish people? I don't think I mentioned anything about religion in my restoration FAQ.
Okay, yeah, basically, when the Jewish people were under the control of Rome, there were people who wanted to become a little bit more like the Roman society, join their activities, join their sports, join their social meetings.
Oh, yes. How long Foreskin Restoration's been around, yes.
Right. And they were basically using a weight that was attached to the remaining skin to elongate it. And that's pretty much something that we still do.
Yeah. Which reminds me, I'm struggling to figure out what I'm going to do for an illustration on the piece. So if either of you have any suggestions, I was hoping to talk to Ron and maybe have an image of one of his devices. But if there were any, I was hoping to use a photo of a restoration device. But if there's anything else that you think would be appropriate, a logo maybe, whatever you suggest, I'm very open to that.
The one thing I would avoid, if I were you, because it has become very cliche and very much a joke, is the picture of a banana or any banana-related imagery. Also, you'd want to avoid any pictures of knives, scissors, or cutting implements. So I think having a picture of a foreskin restoration device is a very intelligent way to go.
Okay. I might lose control over it.
I understand you have editors.
Have a conversation with the photo editor.
Yeah.
Usually for my Sunday pieces, he just takes over, so I'll have a conversation with him. If I can secure if either of you has a photo of a restoration device that I could use, that would be fantastic. If I can secure one with permission to use that is a high enough resolution, then that is what I will do.
I'm sure that Ron would have that for you.
Okay, great. That would be fantastic. Great. Well, that's all I got. Thank you so much, James, for reaching out, and Juan for agreeing as well to talk. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to running this.
Well, thank you very much for being
appreciate
open.
the opportunity to talk about this with you, and I hope you have found something interesting today.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks so much. If either of you does need anything else, please feel free to email me.
I certainly will.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you again, Jenny. I really appreciated talking with you.
Yeah. Of course. Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.